Hey, MOMnation, and welcome back to another episode of our love story with the fantastic Dyanna Eisel. How's it going, Dyanna?
I'm great. How are you?
Doing good. So good to have you back as always.
Likewise. Happy to be here.
Yes, it's already May. I don't know if you noticed.
It's already May. Like summer is nearly upon us now.
I was talking to my kid this morning and I'm like, bro, you have like 2 weeks of school left. Isn't that crazy? And he's all like,
that's it.
Yeah. He's like, I know, Mom. I can't wait.
You're going to be home all the time eating everything that's in the pantry. I can't wait.
Yeah, I'm so stoked. Anyway, that's not what we're talking about today, even though it is upon us. Let's hop right into today's topic, Dyanna. What do you have for us?
Yeah, so something that has seems to have come up a lot recently in some of my sessions with clients is this idea of how we create narratives about like ourselves, our relationship, and our partner, and how sometimes positive narratives can be a great way to build shared meaning where like we have mutual goals and interests and like we understand each other better. But sometimes negative narratives can be created through behaviors that we identify that we don't like or that we find offensive. And that can create this almost like confirmation bias when we observe our partner engaging in certain behaviors or saying or doing certain things that we find offensive. It just kind of feeds that confirmation bias and just goes right into it. So, for example, like if, a conflict from the past or something that's happened that caused an injury, you might have this narrative or this thought attached to your partner as being someone that like, someone who is mean or someone who is avoidant or making these declarations about who a particular person is. And then when there's a behavior that feels like it lines up for you as being the same thing, it kind of feeds that like negative narrative instead of being an isolated event. So if it's, I perceive that he doesn't care about what I'm saying because like, I see like he's not making good eye contact with me or he's looking at his phone or something like that. That's because he doesn't care. Is it because like he really doesn't care and it's feeding that narrative? Or is it because like, hey, in this moment, I feel like you're distracted and I feel like I'm not being heard. And so when we are less objective and we just kind of pile into this negative narrative, it makes it harder to resolve conflicts because we have all this resentment built up. You know what I mean? If you have a narrative that someone is negative, then anything that comes out of their mouth that feels negative or not joyful, is it because they're a negative person and we're feeding that confirmation bias? Or is it, no, in this particular situation, this person's upset about how this meeting turned out because it didn't turn out great. And that's okay. That's very objective, very singular on that specific behavior or topic, and not feeding that confirmation bias, if that makes sense.
It does. And I feel like as humans, we have this crazy capability of being able to notice these things more so. So for example, I want to get a new car. I really don't, but let's just say I do. And I want a cute little red Corvette. And then all of a sudden I start seeing cute little red Corvettes all over the place, right? Can you explain what that is? Because I know that happens. That happens to me. I've had conversations with people all, throughout my life. They're like, wow, weirdest thing. I was going to go buy a car and all of a sudden I see them everywhere. What is that? Is that just like, it's like a heightened sense of recognizing something that we want to see or that fits what we've been thinking about, or like, am I making sense?
Yeah, you're making sense. I think that has more to do with kind of this sometimes groupthink mentality or stereotype mentality, right? Like we've all heard of like the midlife crisis, you know what I mean? And like you have a midlife crisis and you go buy like a sports car or a motorcycle or like something like that, right? And so sometimes we subconsciously like buy into that because again, it's like a confirmation bias thing. It's like, oh, my wife must be having a midlife crisis because she bought a new car. Well, not necessarily. Maybe it's just because she wanted a new car and not because like she's having this like midlife crisis sort of situation. So that kind of ties into like stories that we create about people, the people around us, and stories about ourselves and our lives. as humans, we like things to be predictable. We like things to be consistent. And we like to have an explanation for things. That's how we protect ourselves to make our world a little bit safer, And so we create these stories, these narratives to create that predictability for ourselves. And when we can't, and it doesn't make sense, we feel very unsafe and we tend to withdraw or shut down. But sometimes we create these things to protect ourselves and they're not entirely accurate. And it can create a barrier in our relationships from resolving issues as they come up, because this predictable story we have in our heads is sort of taking over. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it makes sense. And that predictable story can come from something that isn't your relationship, right? Like, for example, if earlier in life you had a traumatic experience with somebody, and maybe now in your head, all men are XYZ.
Absolutely.
Right? Or you had a traumatic breakup and maybe that partner cheated or did something crazy. And now all men are like that. Can you dive into that a little bit and kind of explain why we do that? Is that the same reason? Is that the protection safety thing?
Absolutely. We're always looking for ways to protect ourselves in relationships and how we associate with people. And so if there's this confirmation bias that, all men care about in general is sex, for example, we know that not to be true, but their brains are wired differently than ours, right? So if all men want is sex, then if your partner is like pursuing being physically intimate with you, if you think in your head, like, yep, that's just all he wants from me, because that's all men ever want, is they just want sex. They're not interested in anything else. Is that really true in this case? Or can we really like dissect this and take this apart and identify like, well, no, he's like trying to initiate being physically intimate with me because he wants to and he loves me and he finds me attractive, and not because like that's all that's on his brain at any given time. So again, it's like that confirmation bias, that everything that happens feeds that narrative. And it's like, see, I was right. This is exactly what I'm talking about. I'm right. You know what I mean? It's a way to keep things predictable, but as you can see, it can become very problematic in our relationships too.
So how can we recognize when we're doing this? Because it's clearly problematic.
Absolutely. So our own awareness about us actually doing it helps us to sort of stop the cycle, like before it continues. So is this situation or this thing that I'm hearing from my partner, is this feeding this confirmation bias? Or is this actually just a separate situation altogether? And how do I tell the difference? Being mindful that like this is happening, like I'm feeling this happening, I'm having this thought process, sort of helps to slow that process down to identify what's actually happening. You know what I mean? Going back on the example about like, all men want is sex, right? Of course, we know that not to be true, but again, our brains are wired differently, and men can be more like spontaneous with their arousal, where women are more responsive. So that looks different. If men are more spontaneous, a lot of times, like they're pretty much like ready to go, whatever, what I mean? But with women, we're more like responsive. That's how our brains are wired. So that's where you hear, the phrase like, oh, foreplay starts at breakfast, but it's true. Right? Like, it's like doing the dishes. It's, being really emotionally present, helping the kids out, like all of those things like register differently with us. You know what I mean? So to go back to that narrative, if our partner is initiating physical intimacy with us, is it because they really want to, or is this because like, I need to feel like I have to, like, that's what my job is. Like, that's what I'm obligated to do. And where is that coming from? What has happened in the relationship prior, or maybe a previous relationship, that has led me to believe that that's where my worth is to my partner? Do I have any other evidence to back that up? Do I have any evidence to suggest that like he really doesn't care about anything else that I need besides the physical need? You know what I mean? So it all boils down to being mindful that you're doing it. And that goes for every behavior that we do in relationships that can be problematic. It doesn't have to be a shamey thing. It doesn't have to be like a feeling guilty thing. When you're learning how to be mindful and think about your behaviors differently, it can be as simple as like, oh, you know what? I think I'm doing the thing again. I think I'm attaching this behavior to this narrative that I'm trying to untangle. That's okay. That's okay that I'm doing that. I'm going to think this through. and try to be a little bit more objective about it so that I don't fulfill this confirmation bias. You know what I mean? So whether it's in conversation with yourself in your head or with your partner, like, hey, we're doing the thing again. I'm starting to feel like I'm thinking that way again. So we need to take a pause. I need to slow down and like think this through. You know what I mean? So that mindfulness is how we create change in our own mindset.
I love that you said that at the end, because that's what I wrote down just a couple of minutes ago. Would it be helpful, let's just say we've recognized this about ourselves, would it be helpful to have a conversation with our partner and be like, real transparent, real vulnerable here? Hey, I think like this, possibly because of XYZ, or I don't even really know why I think like this, but when you recognize me behaving in this way, or when you recognize from the words that I say or my interactions with you, when you recognize that I might be on that train, can you help me in a helpful, supportive way? Kind of just recognize it, because if we're on autopilot, which I think we probably operate quite a bit on, we may not recognize when we're going down that train. Like you had just said, oh, I'm thinking like that again, but you might not always really recognize that, right?
Definitely. Absolutely. It's definitely a learning curve. Recognize when we're having thoughts that are problematic. Sure. Is that a conversation that you can have with your partner? Absolutely. Your partner is not in charge of like your thought process, right? But like if they're aware of it, it can bring about a larger conversation to challenge maybe what other narratives they might have as well. You know what I mean? So, the last time we got into this conflict, like, what did you take away from that? Like, what were you thinking about? Like, did this like fulfill some sort of like thought that you have about me? You know what I mean? A really common narrative that a lot of us are probably very aware of is this gender discrimination between being angry or being upset. You know what I mean? Because if, a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times if a man is expressing like anger, frustration, something like that, it's like, oh, he's, standing up for himself. He's advocating for himself. He's firm in his beliefs, or he knows what he wants or whatever. But a lot of times when women do that same thing, it's because she's crazy.
Yeah.
Or she's being crazy. You know what I mean? And so that like gender difference is certainly kind of like a beast all on its own. But those narratives get created very quickly because of how that generational trauma gets passed down and those lessons that get passed down, right? We learn from our parents, who learn from the grandparents, right? About like who women and men are. And when there's trauma, like within those generations, it makes it almost impossible, if the person is not aware of it, to not pass that belief down, right? Like if you see your parents have multiple relationships, possibly multiple abusive relationships, you're going to start to come to your own conclusion about like how each gender behaves or acts in relationships, right? And if mom, says one day like, oh, all men only want you for one thing, right? That gets internalized. And then you're going to probably struggle to be attached in relationships because of that belief. You know what I mean? And imagine the struggle there's going to be with being physically intimate if that's the narrative you've already created before your partner can even like contribute to that narrative. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So and I don't know if this is an answerable question. I mean, you're pretty good, so it probably is. But how do you dig through that in your sessions? Is that like case by case? Is that not something you can even generalize?
Yeah, I think there's like a couple high points to examine when we're talking about this in session, right? Which is like, okay, the narrative about yourself. So you're telling me that you got really angry and you yelled in this conflict that you guys had at home. What does that say about you? Like, do you think that there's some sort of something that it says about you? Or was that just like an event that like wasn't my best look sort of thing? But a lot of times people will say like, yeah, it says that like I can't control myself, or it says that like I'm an angry person. And it's like, well, no, like you're not an angry person and you do have the ability to control yourself. You just maybe need different tools. But if you're going into every interaction with this narrative in your head about who you are, that like I can't control my emotions, it almost gives people a pass. You know what I mean? That like I can't control it. And so it is what it is. Like you just have to accept it. Or I'm just an angry person And that also gives you somewhat of a pass because like that's the narrative that you've already created. And that's really hard for your partner to not buy into that same confirmation bias if you're not willing to challenge it either.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So like, what does that say about you? What does that say about your partner? And what does it say about your relationship in general? So like, what are some of those stories that are already being created or that have been there already? And sometimes it's really surprising. Sometimes it's like, I had no idea that you thought when, you know, I do this or say this, that it means to you, it's because I don't care.
Right.
That's the last thing that I want you to think is that I don't care. It's just that I'm distracted. You know what I mean? A lot of adults that are out here with like adult diagnosed ADHD, right? Which is an entire learning curve all on its own in relationships, right? Even in parenting. But sometimes those ADHD behaviors look like the person doesn't give a shit.
It does. In fact,
they give a lot of fucks about it. You know what I mean? They care a lot about what's happening. But they're impulsive. They get hyperfixated. They serotonin chase. They have it's extremely difficult for people with ADHD to regulate their emotions. So like all of those things wrapped up can create these narratives that like, they don't care. They're more interested in researching than talking to me. They're more interested in doing this. They're spending all this time doing this other activity because they don't care about me. Right. And sometimes, you know, not to go too far left here, but sometimes when that ADHD diagnosis is identified, then we got to go back to some basics about the learning curves of being in a relationship with someone with ADHD, identifying what those behaviors are. And that does so much to untangle those narratives. No, it's not because he doesn't care. It's because he got hyper-focused.
Yeah.
So he just like went all in on that thing. Or it's not because he doesn't care. It's because he's impulsive and he has a hard time controlling those impulsions or compulsions. Or is it he's just really angry? No, just has a hard time regulating those emotions. You know what I mean? And once those things start to get untangled, it becomes more objective when you do run into those situations again. So if you're feeling that same narrative being fulfilled, like, oh, he doesn't care, he's been on his computer for 3 hours. Is that though? Or is this like a, hey, I don't know if you've noticed because of time blindness that you've been on your computer for 3 hours, but like, I just wanted to pop in because we haven't had a chance to talk. Or whatever, you know what I mean? And it just sort of like strips away little by little that narrative that's been created based on not having enough facts about why someone's doing what they're doing.
I think we should do a whole show on adult ADHD and marriage.
I would love that. Absolutely.
Because you know my situation. So I'd be happy to share because there's definitely some struggle in that. But then there's, you know, once you, like you said, once you recognize and once you learn, once you understand, once you have some tools under your belt, you know, that gets a lot easier. And I think that for people who are not privy that they may be dealing with that, it's a very volatile, like scary thing. And I think we could do a lot of justice doing a show on that. So
definitely.
I wrote it down.
It is so common.
Yeah.
It is so common for people to be diagnosed with ADHD in adulthood. And we can certainly dig into that and the whole process of what it's like for the person being diagnosed, but also the impact on the relationship too. Yeah. But that's how narratives get created. You know, that narrative that they don't care, but like there's something underlying here that we don't know anything about. We don't even know if it's there. So it just gets chalked up to like, they don't care. Yeah. You know?
I totally can relate with that. I totally felt that way for a while. And we can get into my story on when we do a show on that. Is there anything else about creating narratives, supporting narratives that might not exist, dealing with that as far as being a couple? Anything else you want to add?
Yeah. If you're listening and you're thinking about it, like what narratives have you created about your partner or your relationship or even about yourself that are maybe not helpful narratives to have, that aren't positive shared meaning, but are ways that are preventing us from resolving conflict, and that are building resentment. So like, what thoughts do you have about who your partner is or who you are that could potentially be problematic? And are there any confirmation biases there that exist that's preventing you from being objective when resolving a conflict? So like, think about that.
Love that. And you are still doing your 15-minute consultations?
Definitely. So you can go to my website, DyannaEiselTherapy.com. You can schedule a free consult, and there's also a contact form on there that you can reach me.
Awesome. I highly recommend you guys do that. Talk to her, take her up on that. If you'd like to check out any of our previous episodes, hop on over to our YouTube channel. It is at MOMnation USA. Do a little baby squirrel on the homepage, and you will see our love story. It's red, so you can't miss it.
Jumps right out.
Yeah. And you can check out all of our previous episodes if you prefer podcast style on your favorite podcast platform. Do a quick search for MOMnation Talk Radio. There you will find us. Please do all the things like download, rate, notify, all of that. It really does help us out. We want to get to this information out to the ears that need to hear it. Thank you again for being with us today, Dyanna.
Thank you for having me.
All right, guys. Bye.
Happy Mother's